Hello everyone, today we talk about the Christianization of the Roman Empire. I come back on this topic that is mostly about late antiquity, but also with certain reflections about relatively to early medieval times. I don't want to put a very strict limits in here, also because it was a very long-term process in many ways. As you know, the Roman Empire never ended. At the end of the 5th century there is a world continuity, so you can study even in those regions of the West into which that were lost by the empire, the survival and transformation of Roman society or Romanized society, and contemporarily see what was happening in Constantinople and so on. So I don't put strict limits also because obviously this is really a huge topic that has to be understood comprehensively. So it's not easy task, even if probably this video will be long just like the others. I will talk in extreme synthesis about the individual elements that I want to point out as characteristic of this phenomenon. So first of all, I would like to talk about the Christianization of the Roman Empire, not just from a religious point of view, which is normally what it's conceived like in popular culture, like as if one day the Christians took over and yeah, the religion changed. No, it was something extremely progressive, extremely diversified also in the various regions of in the various provinces of the empire. And even in the same provinces, in a local scale, there would be very substantial differences. For instance, as we will be seeing between the cities and the countryside, and many other elements. Also because obviously the Roman Empire was multicultural already, so different identities, different cultures and traditions reacted in different ways with Christianization. Somewhere Christianization spread quicker or more easily. In other regions instead that even were formally Christian from a certain point onwards in terms of the main political structures that were governing in there. As a matter of fact, so a very superficial degree of Christianization. And this could happen even at, you know, with regions that were quite close, with other regions into which Christianity instead had deeply and fastly spread. And this is the case, for instance, of Gaul. If you see the Rhone Valley, for instance, that was quite quickly Christianized, and the very center of Gaul instead wasn't for a long time. Especially in the countryside. But aside from this, I would like to tell the story mostly from a cultural and institutional point of view, because what I find interesting and really the key to understand the process of Christianization of the empire is how the Christianization affected actually the Roman state. I mean, the Roman state became Christian officially. It took substantially one century after that Christianity was accepted legally as licitus or licitus, cult, so as a legitimate religion, and this process went in parallel with the creation of a sort of para-statal entity that was, as a matter of fact, in the same church, that began to acquire actually quite substantial political power within, not just within the broader political balance of the empire, but also and especially in the very practical and administration of the same empire. And this was played Actually, very cleverly, there is also the debate where, how Christianity was good for the empire, etc. Probably in the long run it was very very useful for the empire. It was also probably one of those bases that the Constantinian world had actually put it right, even if Christianity wasn't the major religion already at the time of Constantine. But overall, in spite of the struggles that this caused, the empire was better off with this religion being capable of inheriting the Roman state, and even beyond the Roman state, the church was a very important point of reference for the local communities, also in the Latin-Germanic West. So it was evident that the church had a very strong and privileged tie with the Roman state, in spite of all the differences that would be evident from an immediate point of view. One thing is a religion, one thing is a state in the I can't say in the lay sense of the world, because another misconception is that the Roman state was lay. In a way, no, it wasn't. This is just what modern minds tried absurdly to do when looking at the Roman Empire as sort of an enlightened fashion, like in the 18th century, in the century of the Lumière, and the Roman state actually being all one thing with religion since its very start, and being not at all so so tolerant as one might think. I mean, it was open and acceptive of other cults, but it still imposed a recognition of imperial divinity, essentially, into the local to the subjects, actually. So the Christians were outlawed at a point and persecuted because they refused, in their radical view of monotheists that were quite of an exception in the ancient world, to accept imperial, together with their own god, the imperial one. So and the same allegiance to the Roman state was something that, as you know, is challenged by the scriptures, that from one side, yes, basically accept superior power, and this was actually a very important base for the same Christians when they were accepted eventually by the Roman state to magnify, to aggrandize the same the concept of empire as a Christian universal empire. But at the same time, Jesus says explicitly, and not like in the wrong translations, what pertains to the state, to Caesar, gives it to Caesar. What pertains to God pertains to God. So and sometimes it's badly translated as if there could be a coexistence. Probably Christ's teaching in here was much more radical in many ways. It was really going beyond, like in a mind-blowing way for the even for us in our time, to really say that all that matters is about your salvation, your morals, etc. So the politics comes kind of later, well, the translation is rightly wrong, because it says as if you have to give someone to Caesar, that is for Caesar, where actually the proper translation seems to mean to give back to Caesar what is of Caesar, and therefore to have nothing to do with him in practice. But this is kind of theoretical, because eventually the Christians interpreted in another way. As I was saying, relatively to the Roman Empire, it was actually a pretty clever one, pretty useful one for the same state. But what is important to stress in here is that when the Christians were accepted by the empire and even favored in practice, as a religion, they began basically to emulate the same Roman state in their ecclesiastical organization. So the Christian society assumed at that time a kind of reflection of the of the Roman statal character that at that time was a mainly oligarchic, aristocratic thing, because and this is interesting to think of because this had happened because of social crisis, especially the one occurred during the 3rd century. So in the 4th century, Roman society was substantially very stratified, being a lot of differences, a very few and very rich people, and all these masses of poor, among which Christianity had largely spread. And Christianity, when reached at the top, at court, etc., basically evolved its ecclesiastical structure in a very similar fashion to this kind of social stratification, for which there were also practical reasons, in the sense that you can't manage a church as a para-statal entity if you don't give that a head, some kind of verticized administration, something that can practically control the faithful, their offers, and we don't, there is generally a kind of approach to all history that is very classist, and I disagree very much with that. That is as if, there were the few rich people at the top and all the other people struggled. Well, not really. These were clientelary societies into which the only way the guys at the top could maintain their power was to redistribute their own wealth. So it would be obvious that there was exploitation, that there was violence, disequality. The Christians kind of fought for more equality also because they came from the masses of the poor, so that there had to be a positive message in there. Also from a practically political point of view, not just a theological and religious one. But generally speaking, if things went well for the master, for the dominus, as it was called, the things would go relatively well also for the clients that were under him. The same goes even for slaves in a certain measure. Slavery was largely a very crude thing, the Roman latifundia being not very different to concentration camps for slaves, because they were exploited like they were called like instrumenta vocalia. The slaves were called just speaking working tools as such. But you have to think that certain slaves, especially in the wealthiest houses and so on, would be well treated. Also because certain slaves were actually educated. This probably wasn't much the case. It was probably more in the time of the early Roman conquests, like when the Romans invaded Greece and they took hostages and slaves that were very highly educated, even more than the Romans themselves. This time would be a bit different, but just for saying that society was kind of developing toward, was still something that was very very balanced in its own asset. Things were there not because of evil, but because it was probably the best, most efficient way to carry on. And you have to think that these were very, very tough times, also in economical terms. There was kind of shrinking of the same Roman state over more solid basis, into which into which process the Christianization of the same state played a part. The Christians started to become also civically authoritative, meaning that figures like bishops were, especially the most educated ones, who well, bishops, as a matter of fact, at this stage would be quite educated. You know, the late antique world would be producing very great minds at this point. There was also still a very widespread education, especially in the East. And some of the major fathers of the church at this point would be quite influent metropolites of the major cities of the empire, like I don't know, Alexandria, Milan. People who were cultured because they had managed to reach to that top because they were cultured and intelligent. So the whole Middle Ages went on, especially the early Middle Ages, with the on the works of the fathers of the church that have lived into this period, especially during the 4th century and 5th century. Think about St. Augustine or Basil of Caesarea. So yeah, this, I think it's a very important point, because if you what did bishops actually do? They actually had a very strong material and economical power. They organized the church, they fed the masses in the cities sometimes, and what you have in certain cases, especially when the Roman state began to collapse during the 5th century, especially in the West, in the East things were kind of better. The crisis arrived later for other reasons, but while the Roman officials could go elsewhere, literally was the case of think of Britain. At a certain point, if 410, the Romans simply get out of there. And they maintain, Roman Britain was maintained as a sort of Roman society, so there would have to be a sort of local organization, and this happened everywhere the Roman state collapsed. The church was still there. Also because churches were starting to be very eradicated in their organization around the same dioceses, so they had a very strong territorial root at that point. The same which actually was the same one that of the Roman districtuation. So I think that during the reform of Diocletian, the actual base of the basic districtual unity of the empire was the diocese, meant as such, gravitating around a city. And in fact, Christian power at this point would be a mostly urban phenomenon. As we were saying before, even in the countryside, the Christianization was almost absent, especially in the West. And the bishops at this point would become actually quite early to be armed. All the we normally think about the Roman, these medieval bishops armed with mace and armor going to fight, as if that's the Middle Ages. Actually not. During the 4th century, the Christians began to arm themselves. They had armed bands of people who went around. There were a lot of city clashes at this time, even against the pagans and vice versa. So the bishops had to provide, quite immediately, even to the defense, or at least the arming of their own church, and especially in those regions that were kind of frontier regions, where it would be phenomena like, think about Donatism in Africa. That basically was an heresy that, however, it had this superficial religious reasons, but it was largely a social phenomenon of rebellion, especially in the countryside. There would be these bands of thieves and such, clubmen going around and killing and raping and pillaging and stuff. So even the Catholics at that point had to intervene in some fashion. If the Roman authority was distant, as it was the case, this is, by the way, the Africa of St. Augustine, a very peculiar one. You can, if you study that history, you can really perceive how the Roman state was, excuse me, always more absent in many ways, and it really depended on the direct intervention of maybe the Constantinopolitan army, or rather than local garrisons that weren't very effective, especially when rebellions spread among the masses and had a quite of a demic consistency. And in this sense, the bishops actually became not much different from the Roman magistrates, because basically all these powers were the same ones that the Roman magistrates had always had. Administrative, military in part, having to provide to the local well-being and so on. The Roman Empire, this stage, especially in the East, being quite strongly Hellenized, and Hellenistic society had since a long time, almost a millennium, this way of administrating cities on the base of local aristocracies. Well, now the church was the local aristocracy most of the times, or at least it was rising as such, being there also very strong contrasts, as we were saying before, with our aristocracies that were based, for instance, on the pagan temples. The story of Hypatia of Alexandria is quite, there has also been a movie recently that shows this kind of violence existing between the Christians and the pagans, really from both sides. We are all humans. It doesn't really matter. That shows you pretty well how actually the Roman state being something quite distant most of the times, and how these societies were really organizing themselves in a fashion of self-government. Today we live in societies in which the government is pervasive, in which it has the control over almost everything. It can check out where you live, what you do. In those times, also for technological reasons, simply there wouldn't be so strong coercive means for which the state could really punish everyone. No, it was something usually just a show off sometimes with a deterrent purpose, but the actual intervention being also quite rare, and leaving, because that would have costed money. So the Roman state was growing increasingly heavier in this time, but it was still in absolute terms something very light compared to what it is today, the state. So these forms of of autonomous organization were really crucial to determine who could really direct the games in these cities, and it's not surprised that the metropolitic seats of the empire, so those regions in which the local bishops had risen to higher rank of archbishop and kind of controlling the whole province's churchly affairs, were in this sense quite often ruled by the same church in practice. Think about Alexandria, think about Jerusalem, think about Rome at a point. So yeah, that was really it. And together with the Roman tradition, the bishops inherited all those characteristics that had been proper of the Roman magistrates. So think about the eloquence. We were mentioning before how these people were so highly cultured because they were reading the same Roman things. I mean, the Christians at this time during the 4th century emerge also as an educated force, because up to that point they had not been allowed to be so important to leave the Roman otium and dedicate to studies, etc. They had been emarginated and it had been difficult for them to be very strongly educated. They read the Bible if they could, usually. There would be some sort of catechism, but it's just during the 4th century that the Christians began to access to the real education, the higher education that existed at the time, and it was all based on classical knowledge. So all the arts of obviously rhetorics and dialectics would be the same that I don't know, Cicero had, or Cicero better, had, and you know, they read the pagan poetry. It was all about drawing from that very culturally rich world that had been the classical one. So the Christians actually went step by step with the classical knowledge, especially when they kind of got sure that they couldn't be overthrown or repressed once again, so they wouldn't have any reason for rejecting all that amount of knowledge. Then of course there would be still some criticism, and sometimes also a very ferocious one. In many ways the Christians preserved much of classical knowledge just because maybe that father of the church had commented that classical author, and therefore the Christians would read the classical author accordingly, forgetting all the others. But let's say that generally speaking, the church actually was at a point, especially in the early Middle Ages, the only entity capable of understanding that knowledge in order to preserve it in a lay society that was growing increasingly unschooled, illiterate, and so this is how really the process took form. And what is most important, however, in absolute terms, and this is something that starts from the times of Constantine, is that the church started to obtain from the Roman state jurisdictional competencies. Jurisdictional competencies basically mean that you have the right of exercising justice. And justice at that time, like also for most of the Middle Ages and modern era, was a very profitable way also to make money, because by judging also because the church here was judging by its own rules, so not just by the Roman law. I mean, the church integrated the Roman law as well, but basically ecclesiastic tribunals could be, like, you know, very independent in many ways, and this is very important because really the predominance of the church over society that was eventually taken away by the enlightened reforms and by the nation state during the 19th century onwards, is something that from the 18th and 19th century onwards, something that actually started here. I mean, there would be people that basically passed under the church's administration, and at that point they basically lost the opportunity to appeal to the Roman tribunal, to the statal tribunal in some ways, also because it could happen that the church was the only the most important entity there, so even the statal authority being unable to intervene in churchly affairs. Together with the ecclesiastical discipline, so the allowance by the Roman emperors of exercising, you know, the tasks over the community of Christians, the bishops also got this legal and jurisdictional prerogatives that they maintained for a very long time. And what is interesting here is that the church got a freaking lot of fiscal estates. I mean, if you see, for instance, in Rome, at a point during the early Middle Ages, everything belonged to the church. So this caused, from a legal and social point of view, many differentiations that especially you could notice in same Italy between the Byzantine territories and the Lombard ones at a point, because in the Byzantine ones the church had a huge power, and this transformed society accordingly. And the church inherited also the other prerogatives, like for instance the church founded many hostels for the poor, the so-called xenodokia, that were, especially when late antique society was still standing before the Justinian plague that kind of made tabula rasa of everything. There would be a lot of people moving in masses in the main cities for even for pilgrimage to the tombs of Peter and Paul, and therefore there would be very large hostels to host these peoples that obviously were also they were entirely managed by the church at this point, and they would make money out of it as well. And just for saying that the church really began to spread everywhere, and same urban organization would be affected by this, thinking even only in architectural point of view, the building of churches at this time. If you take St. John Lateran, that is the most important church of the world, Christendom. Well, that was also a pretty amazingly good-looking building, very solid. It would be a sort of more looking like a Roman villa in many ways than the churches as we think them. Also because the church at this point, as we were saying, was also entrusted to sort of local self-defense. So even having a walled abbey, that would have been quite useful for defense. We don't have to be at all surprised by such things, because it's really how society was developing at that point, and the same communities basically requested it for their own security in this case. So it's amazing how this was really something macroscopic. Like, the Roman state collapses at a point in the West, and what remains there is the church. When all the Germanic tribes, well, confederations, let's say, arrived in places like Gaul, Italy, Spain, etc., they found this, the only interlocutors at that point, in many ways, not always, but especially in Gaul and in Italy, were in Italy with the Lombards, with the Ostrogoths, really not, because there was still a lay senatorial aristocracy. But in Gaul is the best example. The Franks found really the churchmen as the only great political authorities there that could ensure them the access, let's say, to the newly conquered territories. So that even part of the reason why aristocracies why bishops were so important in medieval Europe also started from here, because the new Germanic invaders had to tribute honors to these authorities, converting, interestingly too, so that they could perfectly keep at bay all the masses of the newly conquered peoples that were most of the times much more many people numerically than the Germanic invaders. So this fusion was a necessity in order to govern these lands. But think just about the political prestige of figures like Pope Leo the Great, that went to meet Attila when invaded Italy. Think about Gregory the Great, that guided from Rome during the 6th century the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, and had diplomatical relations with Constantinople, with the Lombards. These were really kind of extremely politically versed people, and this is not surprise because most of these bishops yeah, definitely archbishops, etc., came from the same senatorial families. The senatorial families had been kind of some of the most reactionary elements of Roman society to Christianization, because they felt that really the fate of the empire was tied to the fate towards the old gods, the old traditions. They were also quite socially elite in their mind. But at a certain point they understood that since they had remained in place, one good thing to participate to this new organization of the church and to benefit from it was to convert, and it would be normal that the main bishops of the whole Christian Europe would be drawn from the senatorial social class of Rome, and later also intermarrying with the Germanic aristocracy. Think about the Carolingians that descended from a Frankish count and the daughter of the Bishop of Metz. So that really tells you toll, and this is probably also thanks to the Church that that we can understand Roman or Latin-Germanic Europe. Like, the Latin-Germanic element in this is really the key. You know, it was all into one. They were really intermingled at this point, because really they were forced by convenience to get together and to form something new, a new solution that gave the identity of modern Europe in many ways. And I'm talking especially about the when I say Latin Germanic, obviously to Western Europe mostly, but this would happen also in the Eastern world, in the sense that in there the Christian actually the Eastern world would be more paradoxically more multicultural, multi-ethnical, but the Romanizing factor was much stronger. So everybody was Roman independently from the origin, and all these people coming from all places of Eastern Europe and Western Asia that were under the Byzantines were Christianized in turn, and that gave and that was also accompanied by the Roman and Hellenic tradition and culture, like the Byzantine administration. Also in the church you had to read the Odyssey, proofs like that, of classicism that maybe remained more strongly in the East indeed than in the Latin-Germanic West. And there would be also another area that into which Christianity spread. That was the areas of public debate. We hinted to that before. Is the idea that the Hellenistic world and the Roman Empire, that was an Hellenistic empire to be honest at that point, would be quite open areas for the Roman world was much open air in many ways. There would be a lot of public debate, a lot of outdoors activity in the city, etc. People went home just to sleep essentially, and the whole day was spent outside, at least from what we know, and in the cities of course. And the cities there would be in the local agora, or the forum, if you take the Greek or the Roman side, into which matters of politics, of philosophy, of religion were debated publicly. So there would be, you find this also in the Gospels, when St. Paul with his disciples goes around the world, like Asia Minor, Greece, etc. He stands into these places in Athens, and these would be places where traditionally philosophy was debated. It was mostly a Greek thing than a Roman one, but also in the Roman sense there would be also a lot of assemblies and stuff. Also the same trials were obviously public, just like they are today. And now it's as if this world passed entirely also to the Christians. So there would be, if you could, if in like I don't know, in the first century A.D., maybe in Athens, you could listen to a debate on the Stoa or the Cynic school in the 6th century, especially when Justinian basically closed the school of philosophy of Athens. You could hear priests, the exhortations of the priests, and general admonitions towards the ultimate fate of the soul, etc. So really a world that that really transformed. They remained, however, in the same places, in the same actual physical places, that were reconverted, were readapted. So really changing face, not substituting it in practice, but also because they were the same people. Sorry. So there would be a lot of biblical reading, the perorations of prophecies. There would be Christianism had actually a lot of appeal on the masses thanks to the evangelic ability of moving the masses, of kind of making them feel certain feelings, certain sensations. You can argue that that society was becoming quite emotional over time, because the threat of the enemies of the empire, the spreading poverty among the masses, was really, something that could really be easily played on by the church, by saying, you're not forgotten. There is a place for you in heaven. There is, you will suffer in this world, but in the next one, if you're really good, you will have what you deserve. So there would be this kind of mass suggestions, of mass commotions. I don't know how to say that properly in English. That were deeply felt and occurred in public speaking, and so on. And and these things would happen, as I was saying, mostly in cities. While you have to think that even at a few miles away from that, the rural communities remaining largely untouched by Christianism. Now, this is interesting because it tells you one trait of the Roman state that was brilliantly understood by the church. That was that if you wanted to control the empire, you had to control the cities, because it is true that the large majority of the Romans lived in the countryside, like in every other pre-industrial society. But the cities were still the strategic points, the cornerstones on which the empire was built, and controlling them equated to control all the rest. And in very pragmatical terms, up to a certain point, nobody actually cared, even from the ecclesiastical side, to venture into the countryside. First of all, because it was dangerous, because there was a lot of brigandage, the enemy raids, etc. But also because the rural communities didn't really care about the Christianity. They had structured over the millennia their local agrarian cults, and they simply, since there hadn't been much of a change, there was not a great technological potential there for change or anything. It was something so radicated into their communities that it was kind of even difficult to eradicate that. So, especially in the countryside, Christianization was carried out mostly by the monks at a point in the early Middle Ages, but it really took centuries, if even not millennia, millennium at least, or more. You don't have to think of. I'm pretty sure there were large areas of Western Europe that in the countryside, especially in places like, I don't know, Germany or the far north, that were maybe formally Christian, but it was still retained. But even up to contemporary times, this happened. Pagan beliefs, or a mixture of Christian and pagan beliefs. This was absolutely normal. So, and the illusion we have is that Christianity spread everywhere, but as a matter of fact, this happened just because the rural communities didn't write. Well, the urban ones did, so obviously history was done really by these bishops at a point from the cities, but we don't really know anything about the masses of the countryside that were the majority, and that, although documented in part, is still largely, and will remain largely, unknown, unfortunately. But we shouldn't stress the opposition of these things. I mean, especially for a polytheistic in a polytheistic world, and from a polytheistic perspective, there was really nothing wrong if other people believed anything different. It was rather the Christians who were more anxious to convert to monotheism the other people. So it was kind of sometimes there was kind of a balance. I mean, there was really no way to make it a great fuss about that, because in practical political terms it wouldn't be convenient. And therefore this process of Christianization took really a long time, and it was probably better in many ways, because it happened step by step. There was no attrition, there was no there would be some very also sad events, because at a point there would be quite zealous missionaries who went, I don't know, destroying the holy symbols of the local communities, and in turn the local communities would martyrize the Christian missionary. But overall it's not so conflictual as modern politics wants us to believe, because to us, especially in our world now, after 9/11, after many things that happened also before, of course, we like to stress this idea of clash of religions, or clash of civilizations, but if you really look at history, and this is a pretty good example, that was really one of the last things among all the very messy things that happened. And religion is often, independently from which religion it is, very often instrumentalized, for which the causes of the greatest crimes are really lay in the human evil, and not in the kind of religion you're following. So it's something that it's being studied. I'm not making it a religious perspective now. I'm really analyzing it from a cold, completely neutral way. If you study anthropology, if you study history, indeed, if you study every kind that has to do of thing that has to do with the human mind approach to religion, you will find that in practice there are many other factors really playing in the human actions that guide them. But however, we have to mention one thing, is that indeed the Christian world, although stressing the individual conscience and conscious choice between right and wrong, in spite of the fact that it brought a kind of humanistic approach even towards I don't know, the slaves. I mean, it stressed human equality in many ways. It's also undoubtedly true that it basically forbid any other form of belief where it could. In 392, the Emperor Theodosius I basically banned the polytheism everywhere, together with those doctrines that had been declared as heretical by the Christian councils. So the Christian world was really rapidly spreading without giving any other chance to the to the other traditions, to the other identities that existed from a religious point of view. And there would be, however, some degree of cultural flexibility in this sense from both sides, as we were saying, because conflict is never usually the last, it's kind of a last resort in many ways. Uh, People prefer to change their mind, or maybe to keep believing what they want in private. And even this ban of other religions has to be seen in practice. You know how effective was there. We said that the Roman state being actually quite light after all. So if anyone wanted to believe the same things, well, surely you couldn't go shouting it under the imperial palace in Constantinople. But if you lived even in the country or somewhere else, nobody would really care, in my opinion. And it would be always evident by to the authorities that large amounts of population still retained quite unorthodox thinking at least, and actually what troubled the most, historically speaking, were actually heresies. Constantinople had to deal with a lot of mess happening in especially in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, and all the heresies that were spreading there. Once again, not just for a theological point of view, but because simply the local churches didn't want to pay to Constantinople the tax that was imposed on the same churches, because churches at a point on the base of their wealth would have to pay a quite consistent price, often in gold. And that was quite of a solution for a state to draw resources from the church as well. So you can understand how complicated and complex all things were. You can't really draw a precise line or make it black and white. And it's everything has to be analyzed practically case by case, but it's still important. The next to all these differences, the Christian the Christian language spread in many ways. Even at the level of the masses, there would be abbreviated formulas or other kind of symbolic figures that were used as a vehicle for the spread of theological awareness. So you don't have, obviously, to think of Christian masses as really aware about their own religion. All they cared about largely was being saved at the end of times. That was the promise. There was also a lot of contractualism in the way people approached Christianity, especially because it was contractualism was proper of polytheism, so it would be normal to conceive it initially in that fashion. Local bishops in the well deep into the early Middle Ages would say, but still people are convinced of things like that God is the sun, and when they get out of the church they kneel in front of the sun. I mean, retaining openly these kind of pagan traditions, and it would suffice at a point just to to kind of mix that. Also, you have to think that would mix that with the Christian beliefs for making the ecclesiastical authorities be content overall. And you have to think that the same pagan religion at the time of the spread of Christianity was actually very different from the one it had been, say, 200 years before. Like, the ancient Roman religion wasn't out there in any way. Like, basically by the end of the 1st century BC, we know practically that the Romans of Rome didn't even remember their own, the meaning of their religion. People think that Roman religion is the one that the Romans eventually adopted from the Greeks with the God's pantheon, etc. But really, Roman religion is something very specific in the history of religion, and this is the ancient religion of Rome, that was something so archaic that indeed, even in the late Republic, the Romans carried out their own cults and rites, but they didn't fully understand their meaning anymore. Then eventually, when the Romans kind of Hellenized, especially the elites, yeah, the polytheistic pantheon of Greece was kind of adapted to the local Roman deities, and this is what happened also elsewhere during the process of Hellenization of the empire. But this form of religion, in turn, would become something, it kind of evolved. The religion of Julian the Apostate was basically monotheism in many ways, or better, there would be a top god that was usually a solar divinity, and all the other small gods in hierarchy, and that simply reflected the view that those peoples had on society, what that religion had to do with the ancient one of the same Romans and Greeks. Well, it's very difficult to see. We don't really have to take the Christianization of the Roman Empire as a sort of cutting event that changed everything from a day to another. It was part of a process, I would say, of a natural process of evolution of beliefs, of the adaptation of the same, that always reflects the change in society in many ways. So that the same Christianity today is radically different. It's very, very different from, I'd say, the medieval one, or very, very different from even the early, the very early one. So we change, people kind of adapt. So it's much healthier to conceive history in this fashion than saying, oh yeah, now arrived, I don't know, the X religion and everything changed. No. Also because we know that humans don't do that, that humans are not programmed biologically and socially to undergo these sudden changes, if not unless something extremely traumatic in society doesn't happen, that is much more structural and material in many ways. So yeah. So I think it's enough for today. There would be a lot of other things to add, and I'm sure I will have the time to do it in another time, but I just wanted to introduce the topic as it is, as I did today. Generally, yeah, I'm able to make better videos about things I'm not really expert on than to the ones I know best. So this one, however, turned okay, and that's all I care. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or just subscribe to my channel. If you have any question, feel free to ask. And I thank you heartily for listening to me. And as always, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.